Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire, who's going the full Marcel Marceau. Look him up, kids, mime artist there, to count me in. I really just, all I have to do is move the script down, Kieran, and I'll be able to see when the recording light's on. That's slightly beyond me. It's an interview, Kieran. It's a sure sign that autumn's coming along, Kieran, that we're having our interview with Neil Doncaster.
Yes.
It always seems to be this time of year that Neil Doncaster gets lured into an interview where basically it's not an interview, it's a question and answer session with our Scottish fans. We have many, and they have many questions. And my God, they've got long memories.
Especially my ex-wife.
Wow, yeah, God love him. And it was very early in the morning for all of us. Even for you, Kieran, it was quite early in the morning, and he was only one coffee in. But he had some very interesting things to say about Scottish football, and this is nearly all of it. Neil, thank you for joining us. I apologise. I should have warned you in advance that Kieran would do an elaborate countdown into the interview. And then just sort of for those younger members of the audience who won't remember Mike Mansfield, an elaborate Mike Mansfield type body.
I don't remember Mike Mansfield. Who's Mike Mansfield?
Well, you're one of the younger members of our audience,
Right.
Nielsen. Mike Mansfield was a pop guru of the 70s. He used to do this afternoon. It's sort of a kid's version of Top of the Pops. It was all rather sinister.
Yeah, music for me was more sort of 1983 to 87. That was that sort of peak music.
Yeah, let's not
70s a bit early.
Let's not start Kieran on that 4-year period of music, because we will literally be here all day and we've got enough questions to keep us going. Trust me, Neil. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Neil.
Thank you for inviting me.
Not at all. It's one of those calendar moments. I was thinking autumn's on the way because we're talking to Neil Doncaster. I will warn you in advance. Some of the questions, you can imagine what some of the questions are going to be like. Some of our listeners either have your interview from last year on loop, or they have very long memories because they are checking in with some of the things you said last year. I want to start, though, with an upbeat question of my own, basically. I just want to get your views on what seems to be a fantastic story. A football team that was only founded in 2010, founded by one member of the old firm from Celtic, John Hartson, one from Rangers, John Brown, and already they're in the Scottish Football League, East Kilbride. What a cracking story.
Yeah, we're delighted to welcome East Kilbride. They've been knocking on the door for some years and made it through this year through the Pyramid playoffs. And no, we're delighted to have them. And already they've started well in William Hill League 2. So we're looking forward to seeing what the season has in store for them.
They won their first 2 games,
Yep.
which is cracking. And it always brings, I don't know why it brings a little spring to my step, but when you research these teams and you see that their ground capacity is 700, you think that's fantastic.
No, it's a really good news story, and East Kilbride's a pretty big place in a Scottish context, and for it not to have an SPFL league team until this summer has been a bit of an omission. So we're delighted to have them.
Well, for those of our listeners who don't know where East Kilbride is, it's a miracle it hasn't been swallowed up by Glasgow, because it's only 2 miles away from Glasgow, but there's this lovely bit of greenbelt in between, so it's got a specific identity. So it's really good to see them there. So let's get on with the listeners' questions, Neil. We've had a lot of them, so we've had to sort of merge them because there are 3 or 4 general topics that have come up from our listeners. And so Benjamin Lynch is one of many people to ask this question, along with Alan and about 10 or 12 others. Benjamin says, a year ago on this podcast, you were asked about football governance and your views on an independent regulator. Your response was that an independent regulator was an English solution to an English problem. And since that show aired, says Benjamin, we've seen Inverness, Dumbarton, Edinburgh City all being subject to points deductions for entering administration, and many more clubs avoiding administration because of generous owners backstopping operational losses. Do you still feel that an independent regulator is an English solution to an English problem? And if so, what other regulatory steps are you taking to strengthen governance to prevent clubs from disappearing?
Yeah, I do still feel that an independent government regulator for football south of the border remains an English solution to an English problem. We already have a regulator, a football regulator in this country, which is the Scottish FA. Just as in English football, you have the English FA. And I think it does a very good job of being the regulator for Scottish football for football in this country. And I think some of those who see the forthcoming football regulator in England as the panacea for all of football's ills are likely to be a little bit disappointed. But I do want to take issue with one comment in Benjamin's question. Clubs don't tend to disappear on the whole. Now, there are exceptions. Third Lanark being an example, which sank below the waves in 1967 or thereabouts, so nearly 60 years ago. But in recent times, we've been able to work with administrators to ensure that all clubs that have gone into administration have survived. So some, like Inverness, have been able to exit administration via a CVA or company voluntary arrangement. And where a CVA has not been possible, such as with the Rangers in 2012 or with Dumbarton earlier this year, the club has been able to start again at the bottom of our bottom division within a new company structure. So you can't absolutely prevent clubs from disappearing. There may be circumstances where that has to happen, but for the most part, the rules in Scottish football are built and allow clubs to survive.
It's interesting you use the word panacea for the regulator in England, because I'm a big fan of the regulator. Kieran's a fan of the regulator. Has been involved in the process, and I think it's fair to say Kieran and I would rather the situation existed where we didn't need one. But I think the problem is that even now, most English fans don't know what the regulator is actually there for. And as you say, they're able to project all sorts of fantasies sometimes that the regulator will prevent anything bad happening. Essentially, the regulator is going to be like Father Christmas. And I think, for me, that's the biggest issue with the regulator down here.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I think, there does need to be urgent clarity brought to bear about precisely what it's going to be doing, so that it can at least try and match some of the expectations that people have for it. But it's not going to be able to prevent people who perhaps prefer were not involved in your football club from being involved. And ultimately, there are all sorts of questions about how it's going to act, and probably the most pressing issue is any form of financial settlement between the Premier League and the EFL, and that may be an area where perhaps the regulator is most engaged, but it's not an easy territory.
Martin Ray has a question in a similar ballpark, if I can use such a terrible expression. And I appreciate it's difficult for you to give details on individual club problems. But Martin Ray says, can you tell us anything about what's going on at Hamilton Academicals? We were deducted 15 points last season and now have another transfer embargo for failing to pay HMRC. All of this is the club's fault, says Martin, which it's good to recognise and understand that. All of this is the club's fault. The owner and director of football are responsible for this, but we are the next Morecambe or Sheffield Wednesday if something doesn't change. Is it time for a proper fit and proper persons test for club owners and directors in Scotland?
Well, there's certainly quite a lot in this question. So taking Accies to start with, yes, it's absolutely true that our independent disciplinary tribunals have been kept fairly busy with that club since around about April last year. We saw the club being deducted 15 points at the end of last season for a series of rule breaches, including for failure to pay players on time and not acting in good faith in its dealings with the league, as well as a series of financial penalties for further rule breaches. And then ahead of the start of this season, the club were given a season-long transfer embargo for non-payment of tax on time for 3 consecutive months. So that is clearly a difficult situation, and we are continuing to monitor it very closely. Martin asked whether it's time for a fit and proper persons test for club owners and directors. Well, the fact is that the Scottish FA already operate such a test, and they are reviewing whether any improvements can be made to that test. But it is a notoriously difficult area, the sort of fit and proper persons test. Simply reviewing whether someone has existing criminal convictions is not enough. Such a test would clearly prohibit the likes of Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi from being directors on the basis that they had something of a criminal record, but would have allowed the likes of Idi Amin or, dare I say it, Pol Pot, as they were never convicted of a criminal offence. So, what you'd ideally like is some form of crystal ball to determine whether someone will be a good owner or not. And unfortunately, Mystic Meg doesn't work in football, so it is difficult. We've seen the news this week that National League side Morecambe will be taken over by Punjab Warriors. Well, will there be good owners? We can't possibly know. There are many, many examples of new owners being welcomed in by open arms by fans, and then being chased away by the same far less happy fans a few years later. So it's a notoriously difficult area, very difficult to determine whether someone is going to be a good owner or a bad owner. You can tell it when it's happening, but very difficult to tell in advance.
Surely, Neil, there must be ways of making sure that these people have the money they say they have before they take over a club, or certainly they have the money to run the club for 1, 2 or 3 seasons. I mean, outside the idea of somebody with a criminal conviction, it must be easy enough to get someone to put money in escrow or get money to make sure that they can pay their bills and pay their players, because otherwise you're sort of taking somebody's word for it that they've got the funds to run this club.
Possibly. And with small clubs, that might be the case. With larger clubs, where you're talking about wage bills of tens of millions of pounds, it's not realistic to expect all the owners or directors of a particular club to be able to stump up tens of millions of pounds to put in escrow. That's never going to happen. So on the basis that clubs are currently funded largely by broadcast income, looking purely at what source of funds individual owners has may be relevant when it comes to a smaller club, but with larger clubs, I think that's a much more difficult area. Again,
in that we're still in the same ballpark. We're moving further and further towards the entrance, or it'll be the exit. We want to get out of it. We want to get further back into it. Conor Barr is an Inverness Cali Thistle fan. And he asked a question that a lot of fans, certainly in England, have asked us in recent seasons, Neil. And he talks about the precarious situation at Cali Thistle. He talks about Edinburgh. His question is, though, about points deductions and other sanctions. But why are clubs penalised in a sporting sense for issues that are due to financial mismanagement and have nothing to do with the actual football? points deductions, etc., only serve to hurt the fans and staff at any given club, and actively push clubs closer to situations like being relegated, like Dumbarton, which would surely further harm a club's finances further. And whenever I'm asked this question, Neil, I have to say I fully agree with you, but I can't think of anything else that you could do that would affect the owners and not the fans.
Yeah, I think Connor's argument is a superficially attractive one. Why use sporting sanctions to punish financial rule breaches? So I get that, but as ever, I think it's slightly more complicated than that. Clubs run out of money usually because they're spending more than they can afford to on players. So some would call that financial doping. So in reality, I think it is to do with football. It's to do with the amount of money that the clubs are spending on football players that they can't necessarily afford. And there is clearly an unfair sporting advantage if gained by clubs when they're paying more than they can afford. They then go bust. And clearly a key purpose of a points deduction is to redress that unfair sporting advantage. You want all clubs to play by the same rules, to be able to live within their means. And if clubs are living out with their means, if they're not able to afford the players that they're using to play games of football, then there is a clear sporting advantage that needs to be redressed through a points penalty when you run out of money.
I just want to bring Kieran in here very briefly, Neil, if you don't mind. Kieran, if anybody knows the answer to this question, it's you. Is there a way of distinguishing between a financial penalty and a sporting penalty?
I think you have to look at exactly what has happened. I do agree with Neil that if you spend an extra £200 million on wages, then that gives you a financial advantage because you can recruit better players, and you've ended up in a position in the table which is perhaps a falsehood given your underlying resources. So therefore, given that you've had a points advantage from recruiting those players, a points deduction does seem an appropriate item. If, however, the accusation against the club is, let's just say, for non-cooperation with an investigation, there is no sporting advantage being derived from not cooperating with an investigation. And therefore, for me, a financial penalty is appropriate. So I think you can draw wavy lines rather than strict lines when it comes to appropriate sanctions. What is the purpose of the sanctions? It is to act as a deterrent. And if clubs see that if you misbehave, you get a slap on the wrist in the form of a small fine, then that acts as no deterrent. So therefore, it has to be more severe than that. I can understand it from a fan's point of view. And what we've seen south of the border is been a field day for lawyers and accountants, which I don't feel comfortable with at all. What is perceived as a lack of consistency and feelings running high amongst fan bases who feel that they've been disadvantaged. And I absolutely sympathise. You know where I stand on the Palace issue. That I think it's an inappropriate sanction, given that we've seen financial penalties given to other clubs.
If you've shopped online, chances are you've bought from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes it incredibly easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/promo. Go to shopify.com/promo.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso Virtuo Coffee Machines. Ready to enjoy the bold flavors of barista-quality Nespresso iced coffee at home? Simply fill a glass with ice and press the brew button on your Virtuo Pop machine to enjoy rich double espressos roasted to stand up even when chilled. Refreshingly bold iced coffee. Refreshingly easy to make at home. Visit Nespresso.com to shop now.
And I hope to find out soon, Kieran, where you stand on a rule that's never been invoked in the Premier League in the 6 years as it existed, suddenly being invoked yesterday. We'll have that discussion Although Neil has skin in this game as well, being a good Croydon boy somewhere deep down in your background, aren't you?
Yep, yeah, indeed, yeah.
Yeah, do you know what? It kind of plays into the Palace fans' narrative, really. We have this expression, typical Palace, that it couldn't be. It's the fifth time since 2019 it's been used in top flight football anywhere in the world, and we quite like the fact it happened to us because that's peak typical Palace, basically, coming on top of UEFA. We're also really concerned about the fact that the UEFA have appointed a Greek referee for our game on Thursday night, because obviously, being Greek, he'll have some sort of connection with somebody at Nottingham Forest. Of course he will. That's how the mind of football fans work, isn't it? You just have to... So, yeah, that's where you find yourself in WhatsApp groups saying, come along, lads, really, seriously, what are you thinking? Anyway, Neil, it wouldn't be our annual conversation with Neil without mentioning two certain clubs that are bigger than all the other clubs that we mentioned before. And as you can imagine, roughly 50% of the questions we got were about these two clubs. We've chosen Johnny Graham's because he's asked it in a quite elegant way, basically, and without mentioning the name of the two clubs. Fairly certain he's not talking about Aberdeen and Hearts. Johnny Graham says, what is your personal view of how Champions League money has effectively made the SPFL a one-team league that is often won before a ball is kicked every year? And what's your plan to resolve this and to make our game more competitive and marketable? The thing is, Neil, as well, it's not just in Scotland, this issue. You can ask football fans all over Europe and they will pick two teams or one team in their league that effectively are getting the same benefit from Champions League money.
Yeah, no, I think it's worth recalling right at the start that the current Scottish Cup champions are Aberdeen, not one of those two clubs. We've still got four clubs in Europe this season. In the Scottish Women's Premier League, we've had four different league winners in the last 4 seasons, with Hibernian, the current league champion. So there's a bit more competition in Scottish football than perhaps some give it credit for. But there's no doubt that Champions League money really does distort European domestic leagues. And I think that's the case, as you say, around Europe, and it's an issue. So, with the vast sums of money available in the Club World Cup, those leagues with clubs in that competition are going to face further distortion and further imbalance. So I do agree with Richard Masters when he says that it's absolutely vital that leagues are at the table when it comes to discussing the scheduling of the Club World Cup in future. So no, that distortion, I'm afraid, that polarisation of wealth, it's a factor in Scotland, but it's absolutely a factor across most of Europe. And that's perhaps why it's so refreshing to see the likes of Tony Bloom, who's recently invested in Hearts, who has talked very openly about wanting to challenge some of the dominance that you've seen from the very biggest clubs in Scotland over the last 30 years. So let's see whether that comes to pass.
Well, he's been able to do that with the Union Saint-Gilloise in Belgium. I know
indeed, it's an incredible story what's happening in Belgium.
It is, and you think if they can win the league there, then Hearts certainly can win the league in Scotland. I suppose what doesn't help the image of Scottish football to an extent is, Paddy Power are very, very good at publicity stunts. But Paddy Power already paying out on fans who have put money on Celtic to win the title doesn't really help you image-wise, does it?
As you say, it's something they like to do, and good luck to them. But I don't think it's reflective of the reality in Scotland.
Yeah, the last bit of Johnny's question, is it even within your remit to resolve how Champions League money is distributed to Scottish football clubs?
No, that clearly is a decision that is a UEFA decision. The ECA, that our biggest clubs are very well represented in, clearly has a very large say in that discussion. But no, fundamentally, leagues are not directly involved in a conversation about how Champions League money is divvied out.
See, you've mentioned UEFA now. You've set my Twitch going again. I've had at least 2 proper nights' sleep recently, but now and we've got 2 specific questions, both from people called Scott, oddly enough, about the broadcasting deal in Scotland. And Scott Middleton says, why does the Scottish football TV deal lag so far behind comparable nations in respect to finances, availability, and fan value for money. So stats from 2022 illustrate that Scottish football receives around £30 million a year to show 60 games. In Denmark, it's 46 million for 250 games. In Sweden, it's 48 million for 240 games. And in Norway, 62 million for 240 games. That sounds like too many games for me. In the same way, I think the English Premier League is showing too many games, to be perfectly honest. It's very exciting. But I'd be interested to hear what you think of Scott's point.
Yeah, well, taking Scott's figures at face value, and he's picked countries with similar populations to Scotland. So Denmark and Norway, again, in the region of sort of 5 to 6 million, I believe, which is where Scotland is. Sweden, I think, is around about 10 million or so a bigger country. But in terms of the value that those countries are getting per game for their TV rights, Denmark is roughly 180,000 per game, Sweden roughly 200,000 per game, and Norway roughly 250,000 per game. Whereas in Scotland, we're getting around £500,000 per game for each of our games. So we've focused very much on ensuring that if you want to see all the games, you've got to be there in person. And it's perhaps no surprise, therefore, that per head of the population, Scotland has more people attending games each weekend than anywhere else in Europe by a mile. So, we have very good attendance stats in this country. And I think a big part of that is that we don't have all games on TV. So, we think we're broadly in a sort of sweet spot at the moment of the right amount of games, with Premier Sports coming on board and taking 22 games on top of Sky's up to 60 games. But, we're in the ballpark of roughly £500,000 per year per game. And so per game in our context. And that is a very healthy amount per game relative to a number of other second-tier leagues in Europe.
Scott Ferguson would like to know why the SPFL decided to renew a contract with Sky rather than go to streaming outlets like Amazon Prime or even back to BT TNT, who Scott says thought marketed the Scottish game better than Sky. These services could all potentially offer us more money per game than Sky did. It all seemed very rushed to get the extended deal done.
Well, it certainly wasn't rushed. Sky have been brilliant partners for the league, no question about that, over the past 20 years. I think it's also fair to give credit to BT TNT, who did come in and did have a real go at promoting Scottish football, but ultimately, their appetite for Scottish football waned, and we are in a situation where Sky bid more than anyone else. So, as with any auction, that's typically what you do.
Our next question, Neil, comes from a friend of the show, John Attenborough. You may remember we interviewed John about his book, Following Sam, and then all our hearts were broken when we learnt that just a week or so later, Sam, his dog, had passed away. So John is a blind fan, and John says, I liaise with many SPFL clubs on accessibility for disabled supporters. There's some outstanding work being done by some clubs, which is great, but I consistently hear clubs, especially the much smaller ones, say that they want to do much more, but just don't have the financial capacity. Is there any way the SPFL, the SFA, or even some sponsors could help support those clubs with a small pot of funding that then could be tapped into specifically for accessibility improvements?
Yeah, so facilities generally are within the Scottish FA's remit rather than the league's remit. And the Scottish FA have a pitching in campaign which aims to raise millions of pounds to upgrade existing facilities and build new ones. And the work that John has done as a real advocate for the provision of disabled facilities has been fantastic. It was a real pleasure to work with John and Sam when they did the 42, went to all 42 grounds in the SPFL, and we gave them a medal to recognise that achievement. So we'd love for clubs to be able to afford to do more. There is obviously a real squeeze on incomes, as we know. There's a cost of living crisis, so it's difficult. And we certainly support clubs' efforts to do what they can, but primarily facilities is very much a Scottish FA responsibility.
Yeah, and the other problem is as well that so many of the issues are with transport and travel.
Yeah,
aren't there? Which again,
it's not easy. I was extremely proud when I was at Norwich of the work that we were able to do there, working with disabled supporters to design facilities that they wanted. It wasn't all the same, so you had different bits of facility, bits of disabled provision in different parts of the ground to suit different tastes, different desires, and different needs. So, where clubs can afford to do this important work, then all credit to them.
Are you happy though that Scottish football is doing enough to make sure that the voice of disabled fans is being heard?
But you can always do more, Kevin. I mean, in every respect, you can always do more. We'd like to think of ourselves as a consultative industry. We'll meet with anyone that wants to meet with us. We met with the Hamilton Academical Supporters Group recently on the back of their concerns. So we're always happy to meet and to listen and to feedback concerns where we can.
This question comes from Gavin, aka Scotland's Coefficient, on Twitter, or X, or whatever we're supposed to call it these days. The producer guy tells me obviously I have to say Twitter X. I just want to say Twitter because I don't somehow want to give Elon Musk any. But I've done it now. Just mentioned his name. Shouldn't have done that. But Gavin says in 2022, Scottish Premiership clubs said they wanted to move the SPFL from, I quote, a largely administrative function to a more robust and dynamic commercial structure. Is the SPFL still a largely administrative function, or has it progressed since then as the clubs requested?
Well, I think we've got to remember that primarily we are a league competition, so we're there to run the league fairly and efficiently, and to sort of the secondary role that we have is then to maximise the value to clubs of participating in the league competition and the cup competitions that we run. But there has been huge progress made since 2022. We've created something called Scottish Football Marketing, which is a one-stop shop for marketing and sponsorship inventory across ourselves, the SPFL, the Scottish Women's Premier League, and the Scottish FA. So it's, if you want to be involved in Scottish football, we have that one-stop shop that serves all three parts of the sixth floor at Hampden. So that has seen a number of new sponsorships being sold, so including the William Hill title sponsorship for the SPFL. We've got Carling as the official beer of the SPFL, and we've got KDM Group, who are announced as the new title sponsor of the Challenge Cup. So those deals, in combination with the record broadcast deals that we've done in recent years, that's created record turnover, record fee payments to clubs, record prize money in the Premier Sports Cup, and now record prize money in the KDM Evolution Trophy. So I do think that the SPFL is far more commercially active than it has been, and frankly, the result is record monies to our clubs. So I think we remain a league competition, but one that is absolutely focused on ensuring that the member clubs benefit as best we can from their participation in the league.
The Evolution Trophy brings us nicely on to the next question, Neil, which is from Nathan McKenzie. And Nathan McKenzie says, could more be done to push clubs to play more young Scottish players, maybe through a points bonus or greater prize money? And there could also be potential for a trophy for the club in the SPFL who gives the most minutes that season to young Scottish players. But I don't know much about the Evolution Trophy, but I've noticed in watching Sky Sports, like to tell me that's how bad things are when you find yourself switching Sky Sports on at 7:15 just to watch the scores come in from trophies you've never really heard of. But clearly a lot of young players are playing in that tournament because there's a lot of A teams there. So that's one way that young players in Scotland are getting money. I'd say I like Nathan's idea that just as there used to be a fair play trophy, that you get a trophy for playing the most minutes that season to young Scottish players.
Yeah, I mean, we used to have financial incentives back in the days of the SPL for young players to make up matchday squads. But the reality is that those players largely stayed on the bench and were actually then prevented from playing each weekend from being on the bench rather than incentivised to play. So I do agree that it's important that we all work together to promote opportunities for young players. And that's why this season, working with the Scottish FA, we've seen the launch of collaboration agreements, which allow top-tier clubs to partner with lower league clubs, and those massively increase the opportunities for young players to play games, whilst maintaining the flexibility for those players to move back and forth between clubs during a season. And that has increased game time for those players. And then, as you say, we've also launched a new format for the KDM Evolution Trophy with a UEFA-style league phase, which gives many more games for the top-tier under-21 teams in that competition. And, we have seen a lot of talented young Scottish players come through the game in this country. You look to the likes of Kieran Tierney, who got onto the Celtic team very much on merit in his first stint at Scotland, now back. And we've seen recently Ben Brand, who scored a wonder goal at Easter Road for Kilmarnock in the last fortnight. But the Cups in particular do offer a real opportunity to clubs to blood young players. And we've seen lots of examples of that. Arguably the best recent example is Lennon Miller, who made his debut for Motherwell in the Premier Sports Cup in 2022 and got his big money move to Italian club Udinese this summer. We saw this last weekend Dane Murray scoring for Celtic, Findlay Curtis scoring for Rangers, both in the Premier Sports Cup, and of course Owen Sturton, who scored for Dundee United. So I do think that the Cups can offer a real opportunities for young players trying to break in.
Thank God both Celtic and Rangers had a young player who scored last week. That would have been tricky. Can I just clarify something you said in the middle of that answer there, Neil? So there is a situation where some young players can play for two clubs. They can play for their parent club and another club during the course of the season. Is that right?
Yes, exactly that. So that's the whole basis of collaboration agreements that give that flexibility. And you see it's used a lot across Europe, where in some countries you have dual registrations. But here we use these collaboration agreements as a way of ensuring that the young players have really good game time out on loan but can come back. Whereas in the past, when it was more difficult to come back, clubs were more reluctant to send those players out on loan and like to have them there as cover. Whereas collaboration agreements give the confidence that you can send a player out on loan and you can bring them back very quickly.
As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Our penultimate question, Neil, comes from Stephen Johnston. It's a particularly Scottish take on a question that football fans all over the world, I think, are asking these days. Stephen says, when will we see a price cap for away fans like there are in other leagues and UEFA competitions? We're in danger of pricing out a generation of children and working class people of going to football on a Saturday. So, for example, in the English Premier League, it's £30 is the maximum price for an away ticket, even though we understand from talking to some club owners that they can't quite understand why that should be the case and why they shouldn't be allowed to charge away fans as much as they want. But for the moment, and it has been for, I think, 13 or 14 seasons, there is a cap on away ticket prices. But why is there not one in Scotland?
Yeah, I'm generally not a fan of regulation where it's not required. I think regulation should be limited to where it's required, where it's needed, rather than putting in regulation which is unnecessary. So we do have regulation in place within the SPFL that prevents clubs from charging more to an away fan than is charged to a home fan for equivalent accommodation. And we are reviewing the operation of those rules in consultation with our clubs, and that conversation has already started in the last month. So we are looking at it, but I'm not a fan of dictating to clubs what the right price is. The fact is, as I mentioned earlier in this discussion, we do have the highest attendance per head of the population anywhere in Europe. So our clubs do have a very good track record of pricing rightly for their environment. And I think for a league to come along and tell them what they should be charging, I think is the wrong approach.
I understand where Stephen's coming from. So I share his views. I think there is a kind of existential crisis at the moment amongst probably what you would call traditional football fans, that a whole generation of the younger fans and working class people are being priced out. Yeah, Palace are charging £30 for their first European game on Thursday night, which to a lot of fans is way too much. It's an interesting one because it's one of those where you can't do right for doing wrong, essentially, can you really?
No, and in our context where gate money makes up a vastly higher percentage of clubs' turnover than say broadcast or sponsorship income does, then it's clearly a very difficult area for trying to put caps on what clubs can earn. I think it's far better that clubs who are accountable to their own fans are judging what's right for their environment.
Final question comes from Mike Davis, Neil. And Mike says, do you think the size of the current Scottish League is the optimum size, both commercially and for fan enjoyment? And is it a model that could be copied by the English leagues?
Generally across Europe, you do see bigger populations, bigger leagues. And I think because of the coverage that you get on La Liga, Serie A, the Bundesliga, the Premier League, I think it's very easy to assume that all leagues are sort of 18 or 20 team leagues, whereas the reality is that 10, 12 and 14 team leagues are far more common across Europe than the very biggest leagues. And typically, smaller populations will have smaller size leagues. So, there's been a lot of very vocal fan demand for a bigger top flight in Scotland. There was the most recent discussion was this summer, which was led by Falkirk and one or two others in the Championship who were looking for a bigger top tier. But the clubs themselves made it quite clear that wasn't on the agenda. They didn't want to look at a bigger top league. And so, ultimately, what clubs say is what we do. The common misperception is that we're in charge of 42 clubs, whereas the reality is that the 42 clubs are in charge of us. And, we govern and administer the league. We're not there in charge of the league. The clubs are in charge. So the clubs have decided they want a top-tier league of 12. And if you look at the likes of, say, Denmark, for 20 years, they had a top league that was made up of 12 teams like us. So from around 1996 to about 2016, they had a 12-team league. And they then expanded in 2016 to a 14-team league, which a number of people have advocated in Scotland. It didn't work. And talking to my counterparts in Denmark, they suffered from a real dilution of quality, and they reverted back to a 12-team league just 3 years later. So there's no right size for all leagues, but each league has experimented with, as we have, different sizes of formats. And currently, I think a 12-team top tier works very well in our context. If you assume that Celtic Rangers Hibs, Hearts, Aberdeen are not going to be relegated in any one season, then that leaves 7 remaining teams in the top flight, and you've got one definite relegation place and a playoff place. So a 2 out of 7 chance of being involved in a relegation scrap. So it is competitive, and the brand of Scottish football is excitement, entertainment, drama, passion, and arguably the smaller league size feeds very well into that. I think in the lower leagues, there's been more debate about perhaps having larger sized divisions. Currently, we have 10-team divisions in the William Hill Championship, League 1 and League 2. And one of the options on the table was to go to a larger championship. But again, the championship clubs weren't keen when we had that discussion with them this summer. So it remains under discussion. The only certainty is that whatever league format you've got, there are other formats out there that people think could be better. But I do think that the brand of Scottish football is well served by the 12-team top division that we have.
Just 2 things off the back of that, Neil. That Danish expansion you talked about, was that purely football reasons that they went? That just meant that there were 2 teams every season that were out of their depth in the Danish top league?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with the detail of it. It's
Right.
just from conversations I've had with my counterpart. But you're clearly trading a number of so-called bigger games for smaller games by expanding the size of the league, and it didn't work for them.
And I suppose the second thing is that both north and south of the border, if you showed the number of league clubs to an economist who knew nothing about football, he would probably say, well, 42 clubs is too much for Scotland and 92 clubs is way too much for England. If you add the National League, you've got 120-odd professional clubs. So if you were starting again, you probably wouldn't have the number of clubs in either country, would you?
Look, in many respects, if you were starting with a blank sheet of paper, then you might do things a bit different. But the fact is, we're not. We're dealing with a wonderful industry that's survived 150 or so years, has proven very resilient, hugely successful, brings joy to many millions of people on a daily basis. So we are where we are, and there is very much an upside of that. And the downside is maybe we wouldn't have designed what we currently had if we were starting again, but that's not where we are.
Yeah. Neil, as always, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I know you had a very early morning, and I'm sorry we impinged on that and you didn't quite get as much coffee as you might have liked, but it's always a pleasure to get your insight and for you to answer the questions from our listeners. Much appreciated.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure as ever, and thank you very much for having me on.
There's a couple of things, Kieran, I was particularly interested in. Neil's obviously got more of a light touch approach when it comes to regulation than we are about to embark on down here, but also he clearly has much more faith in the Scottish FA as a regulator than I'd say most English football fans have in the English FA to do the job which essentially they should have been doing for the last 10, 15 years.
Yes, and I absolutely understand where he's coming from. I think it's bad enough that you've got 2 regulatory bodies as far as the 92 clubs is concerned. And people need to remember the Premier League itself was a breakaway product. And it was a stitch up by 20 clubs and the FA. And the FA gave control of the professional game to those 20 clubs and has effectively since then washed its hands of the game. And I think that's to the detriment of the game. So Neil's points are valid. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need a regulator because the FA would have stepped up and it would have shown leadership, which it's spectacularly failed to do so. It just wants to run the England team and reap the benefits of that. And you can say, well, perhaps that strategy's worked. We've seen the amazing success of the Lionesses. We've seen England get to further stages in competitions than they have for many a year, and they can therefore say, well, that vindicates the decision that they've made. But that's come at the price of what we've seen in the professional game.
I was also very interesting. This idea of not getting involved as much as perhaps the regulator would down here. That the question about capping away prices in particular, the idea that he's saying he really doesn't want to interfere with clubs' ability to raise money in the way they see fit. And also the idea that a much higher proportion of money in Scottish football is raised through the gate than it is down here, where it's broadcasting that tends to be the biggest earner.
That's right. If you take a look at the Premier League, for example, it works out as £1 in 7 comes through the turnstiles, whereas it's over 50%, far more than 50% is coming through the broadcast deals, both domestic, international, and those from UEFA. It's a very different story in Scotland, and also if you take into account one of Neil's answers about the broadcast deal, the problem for Scotland is not Scottish football, it's English football. And the fact that the domestic broadcasters, the big slots, and by that I mean 4:30 on a Sunday, 2 o'clock on a Sunday, and others are snapped up by the Premier League, means that Scottish football is effectively competing with the EFL for matches, and that's reflected in the price that the broadcasters are willing to pay. That's not an issue in Sweden. That's not an issue in Denmark or Norway. So I can understand where Neil's coming from. It then comes to an issue of our fans being exploited, and let's be honest. When Celtic and Rangers come to town, it's a big event. It's a big event for the hospitality industry of that particular town. It's also a big event as far as the home club is concerned, because they can significantly increase their gate, and then they have that decision. Do we charge most away fans £25 and go for £40 for Rangers and Celtic? You do the maths, and it makes sense. I know there's a few checks and balances to ensure some form of reciprocation, but if I was Kilmarnock, if I was Dundee, it would be something that I would have to take into account.
Don't forget, you can now join our Price of Football Club, where you'll get ad-free listening, bonus episodes and more. Just go to priceoffootball.com and click on Join the Club to sign up today. We should be announcing the date of our next Zoom meeting, Kieran, pretty soon. Hopefully that'll be within the next week or so. And if you have a question you'd like answered on the show, email us at questions@priceoffootball.com.
The Price of Football. The Price of Football.